Oh, yes.
Just 1, 2, 3. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if I can ask you please to if you take your seats, we're going to start. So the plan for the remainder of the evening is, having heard these two august presentations, we're going to have each of our presenters ask the other a particular question related to his presentation to kind of begin to unpack some of what's been said, and then we will throw it open to audience Q&A. And since we don't have it's not a huge auditorium, we'll be able to hear each other, I think, just fine. So are you men comfortable fielding questions without me standing up there with a microphone? Okay, so I'll just throw it open now to Dr. Littlejohn and Mr. Schmitz, and I'll let you guys launch the Q&A after that. And I'll stand up at 9:20. We'll have a final word presented by Dr. Littlejohn.
Sure, I guess I loved your talk. It's nice to have someone who's actually read the books they're talking about, instead of just a journalist speaking. I guess my question would be this. Today, does it really make sense to speak of Protestant and Catholic contributions to political thought in distinction to each other, or is there really only one Catholic inheritance? Catholic with a small c, right? Or is it still important in this age when the Roman Church is so beleaguered to speak of a Protestant font that is distinct from and even in some sense in opposition to Catholicism?
Well, I would have thought, who's louder? Okay. I would have thought your lecture answered that question for me, because I couldn't have asked for really a better confirmation of my thesis that you need Protestantism to sustain liberalism, because you said Catholicism doesn't want to sustain liberalism. So it seems like if that's true, then there is clearly a rather significant difference in terms of the political traditions that Protestantism and Catholicism have nourished, because I would argue, with all the caveats that I made about the ways in which Protestantism did not lead smoothly to liberalism, in which liberalism is not one clear thing, but it's conflicted from the beginning. Nonetheless, I think it is true that Protestant ideas helped generate and sustain many early liberal institutions. And it seems like you would say Catholic ones didn't, and you're fine with that, right?
Right. Well, I would shy away from assigning it just to Protestantism. I don't care a great deal for these genealogies that are often used to claim credit or assign blame between Catholics and Protestants. I mean, already you have very early in the Church's history, the idea of the libertas ecclesiae. So there's an assertion of the rights of the Church over against the state, the distinction you cited. Christ is making distinctions, Paul. So I wouldn't say that that's per se external to Catholicism, but I do think that liberalism, as such, is not a workable ideal, and its problems are becoming increasingly apparent. So I guess my own thought, if this is a conference about Christian politics in America today, would be, why should Christians be the last defenders of liberalism? An idea that most of them have opposed in at least some form. Even the radical Anabaptists drew the line more tightly than our current progressives do. Why should Christians be the last ones to defend this ideal after everyone else has abandoned it? Why should they draw only on it when it seems to have less purchase now than ever?
Sure. Well, let me. I think we can get maybe at how I would approach the question. If I can ask my question to you first, I think it's good to highlight my concern. So, in your post-liberal restored golden age of restored Catholic hegemony, what
will happen in a few years?
Okay. What freedoms will non-Catholics have to practice and promulgate their faith?
Right. Well, it would not be an absolute or perfect freedom. There'd be a public
Right.
prestige granted to the true faith, but it would not be totalitarian either. You know, Catholics believe that anyone who's baptized is a Catholic. You know, it recognizes, you know, any baptism done according to a Trinitarian formula. And so the church has a duty and charity to encourage right belief among those Christians, and also to share the faith of anyone who is not a Christian. Society should make it easy to get to know God and to live virtuously. But you know, Christianity is not totalitarianism. You can't force someone to believe something that's correct. You can't actually make them submit to truth by means of force. So there'd be a certain liberality without liberalism. But you know, I guess when the king calls me and asks me to promulgate the true order, I'll have to study these questions a bit more closely.
Okay, because I would argue that statement that you cannot try to coerce belief is a Protestant contribution, and that is one the Catholic Church has generally denied. I mean, there's an article in First Things by Thomas Pink, I think it's Thomas Pink, a few years ago, basically making just this argument that people mistakenly read Vatican II as saying that the Church acknowledged a right to liberty of conscience, but in fact, the Church has always taught that conscience can be and sometimes should be coerced.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of coercion, some subtle, some explicit. It's worth deconstructing that a bit. We can have some fun, hang out with a Frenchman, and realize that there's always coercion going on in any society. So, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that, you know, the idea that faith is an absolute that can't be coerced in any way, but obviously there are going to be, you know, real limits on how that's done. We don't witness in the Acts of the Apostles going around and pinching people, saying, "Become a Christian or I won't let up." I should have tried that with my sister when I became Catholic, but she remains Protestant. Yeah, there'll be, you know, I think that it's just folly to have kind of too strong an idea of coercion being totally illegitimate or totally off limits. But also, you know, Christianity is kind of a very realistic idea of the limits of coercion. You actually want to bring someone into a relationship with God. It cannot be a totally arranged marriage, right?
So, okay, so then I would say the reason I think that, I mean, I take your point that do Protestants and Catholics have more in common than they have than divides them right now, and in our current cultural moment. Should we be looking for that common ground, or should we be accentuating differences? I think there's all kinds of reasons to be working together on those points where we have a shared vision of what a Christian society might look like. It's very different than what we have now. But I do think, as Protestants, we have an important commitment to certain features of liberalism in our recognition of the fact that that faith can't be coerced, our recognition of the fact that our love of neighbor calls us to exercise great patience and with those who are in error, and the fact that as Protestants, we would emphasize very strongly the fact that our grasp of truth in this life, any human authority's grasp of truth in this life, is very limited and provisional, and so we have to carve out plenty of space to allow disagreement. So I think that means that a Protestant, I would be an apologist for a Protestant political order in a sense, just as you were arguing for a Catholic one, but I think a Protestant political order is one that is committed to substantial space for dissent and a recognition that we have to exercise great patience and persuasion as we seek to convince other citizens of our vision of the good. Ben?
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
whether it's a Catholic or a Protestant social order, how exactly does it look different from the disaster we have now? Which is to say, how on earth are you going to honor the claims of Christ? Let's just bracket for a section for a moment the question of coercion. How is there any primacy given to either Christ in the Catholic model or the Protestant model in a way that differs from the sort of moral free-for-all and religious free-for-all that we aspire to and seem to have now created?
You're saying how is either of these different from what we have now?
In other words, you both criticized the modern liberal idea of pluralism. What on earth does a non-pluralistic society look like? That is, both of you have said it would be have a kind of tolerance to it. It wouldn't just be people knocking on your door saying believe or die. But what does it look like? Because if we don't know what it looks like, how can we aspire to move toward it at all? I don't know.
I think that's a question I wanted to avoid in my lecture because I think it's a very difficult one, and so I devoted I titled my lecture "Christian Politics After Liberalism," but I instead just criticized liberalism and said nothing about what Christian politics looked like after it.
Fair enough.
But there, I think we could get a few answers if we looked at the shape of those criticisms. The shape of the criticism suggests at least an embryo some solutions. Certainly there would be, it wouldn't just be the terms people use in describing why they're adopting certain public policies. Surely the economic order would be different somehow. And the laws about what we can do to each other would be different. So I love what Pope Francis says about a throwaway culture. For him, this is an economic, environmental, and moral criticism. It has to do with sexual culture, where there's no-fault divorce, abortion, things like this. It has to do with conserving the environment, and it has to do with a much greater stress on the plight of the poor. One of the things that happens in a free market system is that there's very clear justification for anyone's poverty, right? If the market is free and we can all act freely, this person's poor, they've acted poorly, they get what's coming to them. So that makes it a bit harder to speak with the voice of the prophets. So there would be differences on all those areas, but exactly what they would be is, I think, a very good question, one that I'm not sure that I can answer right now.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I think I would say the most fundamental thing, first of all, I would say we have examples we can draw on. There have been, in fact, there still are, formally Christian societies, and it's quickly falling apart. But in the UK, there's still an established church with a pluralist society. Now, that is the sense in which the church has any authority is deteriorated, but you have had, through the last few centuries, plenty of examples, particularly in Protestant countries, of an established church, an established confession, a head of state who is sworn to uphold that, and yet a recognition that a large number of citizens don't share that, and so the society has to figure out, okay, what are all the things that we can allow them to do that are out of step with this established creed, that do not, lead to social chaos? And there may be all these things that we allow them to do, but there's still, as a society, there's a public confession that this is what we, as a society, are committed to, and that kind of sets the framework of what acceptable freedoms are. So I think there are models to look at, but I'd say the key thing that is different, of course, between what a principled Protestant pluralism look like versus contemporary pluralism that we find, that I think I would agree with Matt, it's not really pluralistic, it's not really liberal. I think what we're seeing in the wake of Obergefell is just kind of, American supposed liberalism showing its true colors, that it really isn't very tolerant of dissent. But I think that the key difference is we might say that the exact shape of the creation order and of the moral order that God calls us to instantiate in society, the exact shape of that order is not always clear to us. And certainly the best ways to instantiate it in any given society aren't always clear to us. But we know that there is such an order and that we are compelled to respect it, and that if we don't respect it, then it's going to backfire on us very quickly. And so we have a strong incentive to try to discern the framework of the moral order of the world in which we find ourselves. And that limits the kinds of freedom that are and aren't allowed in society, because we recognize some kinds of freedom are just rapidly self-destructive and societally destructive. The kind of pluralism we have now is built on the idea that there is no moral order except what we establish for ourselves, right? It's a completely voluntarist concept of morality and meaning. And so there are no limits in principle that you could ever draw on freedom of action. So, Susanna.
I guess my question, so it seems to me that you're both agreed on the idea that sheer judicial will and totalitarianism of one degree or one kind or another are kind of the inevitable result of this voluntarist ethic that you're talking about. We're both good Thomists, sort of. But that's a natural law understanding of what we can expect from a political order that's grounded in moral reality. That's not specifically, Matt seems to be talking more than you, Brad, about a specifically Christian political order. So what's the vision of or flavor of, is there such a thing as a confessionally Protestant state? Should there be, and how would it be different than a kind of Protestant non-pope version of Matt's Catholic state, other than maybe being a little nicer to dissenters because you sound at least less confident at your personal ability perhaps to discern like what the right lines to draw are. Other than that, yeah. Sure.
No, I would say that the main difference that a confessionally Protestant state would have, there a number of them, but I do think that I think that the confessional Protestantism is largely Thomistic in its understanding of natural law, and so in matters of, say, I think that Catholic social teaching should be small c Catholic social teaching, and a Protestant law that kind of tried to put those things into actions would look very similar to a Catholic one. So I think that's all very true. There would be a lot of similarity there. I think the key difference is a confessionally Protestant political order is much more hesitant about, is able to sustain the kind of tolerance that Matt seems to want to say. Matt doesn't want to be too much of a meanie, and he says, oh yeah, well sure, we'd allow people some sort of space, you know. But I would say—
fabulous clothes, the clerics.
Yeah, but I would say I don't see within his model what real ground there is for not attempting to achieve real religious uniformity as quickly as possible. And I think a profound humility about attempts to make inward faith appear outwardly that is built into confessional Protestantism.
So the confessional Protestant states of Europe that were mentioned a little earlier may be nominally confessionally Protestant in a sense, but I think they would not really satisfy anyone's idea in this room of what a Christian state ought to be in terms of the policies they pursue and the ideology that the state, apart from the nominal support for religion, has. So what about the true Protestant state blocks that? Because evidently we're saying that the Nordic states are not truly Protestant states or have failed to be. Where do they go wrong?
Sure, where do they go wrong now? Well, I think you have I mean, the history of what happened, because constitutionally, in a lot of these places, not that much changed constitutionally from, say, the 19th century version of what it meant for them to be a Protestant state to the later 20th century version. I think historically, a lot of what happened was the World Wars, and just a profound loss of confidence by the Christian leadership in, or I should say, there was always, let's be honest, there were always going to be a lot of nominal Christians in positions of leadership, but there was that nominalism still respected the official, kind of the official confessional teaching, and felt like it really had a lot to offer to the state, to society. And with the sense that the First World War had kind of discredited Christian Europe, there was I think a profound turning away from the intellectual resources of the Christian tradition as a way of supplying coherence to society and a foundation for its laws and so on. I think that's a lot of what happened. I think there was theological liberalism had entered in a great deal. So again, it wasn't structurally something that changed, but it was, if the churches themselves were not being faithful in their teaching, then the statesmen who are responsible to, protect and privilege those churches are not going to be knowing what on earth that's supposed to look like. So of course there's no, you might say, well, something, I don't buy the line that, because it kind of eventually fell apart, something was profoundly wrong structurally from the beginning. I'd say, because humans are fallible, any arrangement that we put in place is going to be prone to decay if we don't keep up our faithfulness. And I think that, in particular, moments of hubris and such as we see in what happened in Europe leading up to World War I. I mean, I think that's really a divine judgment on the churches for their and actually, this is where I would say there was something perhaps structurally flawed, right? I mean, I think the 19th century arrangements tended to foster a kind of nationalism, right? I mean, this is a recurring temptation in the Western world. We have it in America even without established churches. So it's not an established church leads to nationalism. But if you're going to have any kind of national establishment, you also have to have, and I think this is where Catholicism certainly has something Protestantism doesn't have, is a clear sense of the transnationalness of the church, so that you don't identify the kingdom of God with what any particular nation is doing. Because I think that did happen in Europe, and that hubris was judged by God in the First World War, and the result of it was just a loss of Christian moral and intellectual leadership. And I think, so that's where I would say there is something that could be done institutionally better, which is, it would have been nice if out of the Reformation, the Protestant churches had sustained some kind of international conciliarism, which there were moments where that happened, like the Synod of Dort, but there was no ongoing kind of way of visibly attesting to the transnational unity of the church. And I think that was a structural weakness within Protestant Christendom that has come back to bite us.
I guess what I would add is that Christendom ended when the churches divided. It wasn't just a Protestant error. The Protestantism was the error, I would say, as a good triumphalist Catholic. I know we have triumphalist Calvinists here as well. Wolfhard Pannenberg would say that there can't be any resolution of these moral debates we have, debates about the prestige of Christianity, until the ecumenical divide is healed. And Christianity is once again seen and experienced as the religion of peace rather than of division. That doesn't make the repair job any easier, that observation, but I do think there's a theological and an ecumenical problem. Can't sing Christendom until it's been reckoned with.
Not when you said the Christendom ended when the churches split, and then you began talking about Protestants. I thought it was interesting because the churches split about 500 years before that, isn't that right? The Great Schism between Latin churches and Eastern churches. So, one, why wasn't that the dissolution of Christendom? And two, what's wrong with the Russian Orthodox solution? The problem with liberalism.
Yeah, I'm pretty innocent of Russian Orthodoxy. I admire their beards a great deal, but I cannot grow one. But I mean, so certainly, it's a different moment somehow. There was, it wasn't a kind of internal critique somehow. It was, there are multiple territories. I mean, of course, there's not only Orthodoxy. We have the Ethiopian Church, the Coptic Church, the Nestorians in the East. And so, in a way, there could be these competing little Christendoms, and it didn't seem to create the same sort of crisis that the sundering of Latin Christendom did. Why? I don't know. Maybe Brett does, but as far as why is the Orthodox solution insufficient? I like that the Catholic Church is more international. I think that the papacy has evolved in a logical way. In the Gospels, you see Peter being a bit of a fool, but asserting himself when he needs to confess Christ. And you see that happening very early stage in the church. The Bishop of Rome is asserting himself before the other bishops, even when Rome is not as important. See, and the kind of the monarchical and absolute aspects of the papacy arose because the papacy, the Bishop of Rome sought to defend the church against very aggressive forces outside it. So I like having a pope who's a bit of a bully, and I would be less happy with these various national churches that get along like cats. But that's me.
I just asked the question because it seems like in some of the suggestions you're offering, it does seem quite like the practice of the Russian Orthodox Church. So it's obviously a certain kind of social conservatism. It's a close alliance between the church and Putin. It's make it difficult for other non-established churches to do proselytism in the country. It seemed like a lot of similar things that you were suggesting. And then in your response to my question, you spoke about the Pope, the international aspect of it. But it seems like once you get that, if you were to have the international aspect of it, you'd want to enforce something very close to what goes on in Russia right now.
Yeah, I mean, I read these articles about how Putin recently banned a porn website in Russia, and there were these hysterical articles written about the incredible darkness that was descending on the country. I mean, this is just the stupidest kind of little hysteria. I mean, but at the same time, I don't want to see the man with his shirt off. I don't think he's a great Christian leader. I don't like what he's doing in Ukraine, so I try to avoid the kind of Cold War reenactor hysteria or the kind of Western fanboy hoping that we could have something as fine and dandy as the Russians do. I'm not sure that would work out so well, though. I think it is at least good not to be scandalized by the liberal aspects of it.
You mentioned the separation of church and state. It seems as though in American history that in time came to be used as a club against the church, so that there'd be separation of God from anything civil or with respect to the civil magistrate. And wondering if you can comment historically on how that was understood And how did we get to the place where we seem to be saying, or we are saying, God has nothing to do with, outside of your prayer closet, God may not come out.
Well, I think this is partly, Matthew Parks is going to be addressing that tomorrow. Matthew Parks here? No, but yeah, I think he'll be saying a little bit about this tomorrow afternoon session, the one that you and I are also in. But, and I'm not an expert on American religious history, so I wouldn't want to go into it too much. But I mean, of course, one thing to emphasize is of course the point that that conservatives often point out that the Constitution is not making a prohibition of church establishment. It's simply saying the national government will not make a church establishment because there are several different church establishments in various different states. And if the national government were to try to establish one church, it would be obviously create conflict between different states that all have their different established churches. Now, of course, there were some framers of the Constitution, Jefferson, who did, or not framer of the Constitution, but founding fathers who did want to get rid of church establishment altogether. But there were plenty of others who were fine with established churches at the state level, just not the national level. So it's really, but what happens, of course, during the 19th century is simply the fact that the state borders are of course quite porous, and there's there's huge movements of people and immigrants and so on. So the religious diversity of each state makes it increasingly untenable to sustain, I think, religious establishments. But there was, of course, as we know, a pretty unanimous sense that all American statesmen acknowledged the Christian God, and indeed almost all of them, some version of the Protestant faith, and a recognition that that acknowledgement, some kind of public acknowledgement of the status of that religion within America's national soul was essential for America to sustain the kind of freedoms that it wanted to sustain. So how does that get eroded? How does the idea that not having a formal church establishment means no acknowledgement of God? That's, of course, a long process of primarily 20th century judicial rulings and so on. I mean, I do tend to sympathize with the judgment of my supervisor, doctoral supervisor, Oliver O'Donovan, that there was a mistake, that it was not, in fact, really a sustainable arrangement to say, look, we're all going to have a kind of a verbal commitment, an informal verbal commitment to some kind of acknowledgement of the Christian God, but that's not going to be anywhere in our national documents as such. I think it was kind of an understood consensus, but it wasn't institutionalized in any formal way. And I think it shouldn't be surprising at all, but then about 200 years later, that's construed as a formal commitment to be irreligious. But sorry, that was kind of a rambling answer, but anyway, hopefully something to explore tomorrow.
I have a quick question, well, probably not a quick question, we'll go with it. So assuming for a moment we could come out of this meeting tonight by some incredible act of God with a comprehensive and unified idea of what a Christian society would look like. I think based on what both of you have said, the arguments underlying that society would be immediately rejected by the greater American society. So how do we start to make these arguments? I'm not saying how do we accomplish it, because that would never end. But how do we even start to make these arguments when our underlying principles are just going to be ignored from the start?
I think that the truth is beautiful, and so if we are Christians, we begin to act as a counter society of a kind, right? And people see that we are living better, more beautiful, and functional lives than those around us. It starts to look more attractive. I've joked during our current political mess but I'm ready for a Mormon coup. Just, sweep out all of these horrible people that are running for president and install the 12 apostles there. I'd rather have dimitude under the Mormons than under this. But that's because they kind of have a functioning society, and I think that that's one way that regimes slowly change. If there is a group that is attracts elites and is bound together more tightly than an order that's unraveling. It's one way social change happens. So just by our love.
Well, I would say a couple of things. One, I would say I think another reason why I think the Protestant model here is superior to the Catholic model is that I think.
What about the Mormon?
Yeah, well, I hear what you're saying. I think there's no better than what we've got. But no, I would say that the Protestant political thought has shown a real ability to work itself out in very different situations, including situations of where Protestants were minorities and were simply trying to kind of coexist with their neighbors. So we have examples of Protestant church establishment. We also have Calvinist Huguenots in France trying to figure out how to function within a fairly hostile society. And I think the fact that Protestantism sort of focuses so keenly on here are the essentials of what it means to be a Christian, and they are very few, and then everything else is sanctification, means that we can in our context now, we can sort of say, we're happy to feel our way through this and take our time and work with the situation that we've got, and not say, well, okay, liberalism's over, let's start, let's retreat and build the new society right now. So I think we have plenty of models for that kind of patient engagement as minorities within a hostile society. But I think a couple of things that particularly that we should be doing in our context is, one is, I think we have a great opportunity to point out to people the complete contradictions of the liberal tolerance that everyone claims to still. I think Matt is right that a number of people are just saying, actually, we don't hold to that anymore. But the majority of people still think they hold to that, act as they hold to that. But it's easy just to look around at what's happening and say, look, clearly everyone's subscribing to some kind of guiding account of what the world should be like, what the highest value is, which is usually freedom. And so everyone has an idea of what freedom should look like, and that is driving what they think is legitimate expression and illegitimate expression. So everyone's got something that they're trying to establish as the societal norm. And so the question is simply, is the current dominant vision working? Is it actually working for people, or is it blowing this country apart? Is it showing love? Because everyone likes love. Is it showing love to neighbors, or is it not showing love to neighbors, right? So I think we have a good opportunity to sort of do this internal critique of the current disarray of liberal society. And then we can say, let's talk about particular political issues that are concern to you. And I can show you how the Christian tradition, whether Catholic or Protestant, has all kinds of resources for thinking through these issues, like poverty, like environmental issues, like what religious freedom should look like. And so we have some really intelligent answers. So I don't think we're not trying to sell people on the idea of a Christian society yet, but we are at least in a position to make the case to people that liberal society as it's currently sees itself isn't working, and that the Christian political tradition has all kinds of resources to address problems that are not being addressed by the reigning ideologies.
I have sort of two things I would like to bring up, but that's not in this panel.
First, I was interested in something that you each talked about with regard to orthodoxy and dissent, and kind of an understanding of sincere and well-informed and devout relationship with God, as opposed to a nominal practice of Christianity. And I'm sort of curious how both of you would engage with the work of people like Jamie Smith, who talk about faith as something that you assent to and participate in, but also that is something that seeps into you from the outside and from the practices that you engage, the holidays you observe, the things that you're sort of taught to love. I'm curious both what you think of that notion and of what role it might play in the societies that you describe. I'm also curious about what sort of, as citizens of current post-Christian America, you've both put forward an ideal society that claims your ultimate loyalty, the ultimate loyalty of the Christian. And of course, we all know that our ultimate loyalty is to God Himself. I'm not saying that you have like conflated the two. I'm just my question is, what is the place? Is there a place for loving the nation states that we have, that exist, the cultures that we are part of right now, as flawed as they are? Is there such a thing as natural affection for the place in the culture and the political reality that you live in? And if so, what is it? Why not?
Those are both great questions. I don't know if we have time to
These
answer.
are excellent questions. Just be aware it is 9:19.
Yeah.
Stay that, so please.
I don't know if we have time to answer
What was
both
that
of them
rapid,
properly.
please, but then we'll,
Why don't you pick which one you want to tackle?
Yeah, I'll go with Jamie's question because
Okay.
it seems a little bit less problematic. So,
I mean, easier?
yeah, to translate into English. Right, so if we, it's going to be hard to be Christians if we treat Christianity as only an intellectual proposition. I think that's a problem with the church as it now stands, both Catholic and Protestant. Within Catholicism, Second Vatican Council, there was a push to get people to believe the right things, and to discard old unnecessary practices. So it was no longer necessary to fast from fish on Fridays. It once would have been the case that you see a lot more fish on menus here in New York on a Friday. And when you discard that practice of fasting, as I'm sure Jamie would say, you lose the ability for all Christians to identify in a very concrete way with the poor and the hungry, those who are deprived of something. When you have a thick culture, you can have a practice that makes what is talked about in the Gospels real. And so it's going to have to be more than we won't be able to solve these problems by asserting correct propositions. We're going to need thick habits that make them real among us.
Yeah, I would say I like a lot of what Jamie Smith's doing. But I think it can be an overreaction too, in terms of emphasis. He sees way too much of a narrowly intellectualist version of the Christian faith. We need to kind of get it more embodied. And of course, the Reformation was kind of going the opposite direction, saying the Christian faith had become such a sort of embodied thing that it was nothing more than this accretion of cultural forms, liturgical forms, and there were zillions of them that everyone was expected to do. And everyone just spent all their time doing those and not really thinking about what they meant. And so there was an attempt to purge them away so that we could focus on what should Christians actually believe? What were these ceremonies actually supposed to mean? And I think in my work on Richard Hooker, actually showing Hooker trying to sort of navigate how do we sustain that focus on the priority of faith and the priority of theological reflection on what ceremonies are actually supposed to mean for us, what they're supposed to point us toward, while recognizing that we are embodied creatures and it's a lot easier to sustain that faith if it's being done in a community of practices that are actually illustrating those truths for us. So I think it's a dialectic that goes both ways. I mean, there are cultural practices within a church or a national community that help sustain the belief structure of that community. But practices themselves are always susceptible to multiple interpretations. You can't just keep on doing a practice and assume that that's going to perpetuate the creed. Pretty soon, if you're not also catechizing people, they're going to be doing the practice and they're not going to know what it means. Or the other danger is they will have come to think of the practice itself as so essential that they think of the practice itself as having some kind of redemptive significance, right? And that was what Protestants were reacting against. So I think Smith thinks that Protestantism reacted too far in one direction. He wants to react the other way. And I would say I think it may be true at our current moment in America that we need more emphasis of the embodiedness of faith, the role of liturgy, the role of community informing our habits. But we need to also remember that that emphasis can also quickly go off the rails.
My favorite habits are the ones non-square. That's the main habit I recommend to Jamie and others. Let's show nice, baby.
And that is, and I would say that about Jamie Smith's thing. If you play up that too much, and Protestant plays up too much, that the value of these things, then Catholics are always going to be able to beat us on that ground. So if that's where what Christianity needs for its fulfillment, then you're going to end up.
Well, the risk of imposing a social order. I wonder if we could give our speakers a
Yeah, so I think Susanna is going to pass around clipboards. If you already signed up to receive updates from us and such, great. You can sign up again just to show how enthusiastic you are, or pass it to the person next to you and make sure they sign up. So I just want to say a few things about Davenant's mission more generally. So I think if there had been any doubt that we were living in the aftermath of the crumbling of the religious right, of the events of the past week may have put that doubt to rest, unfortunately. And I think this downfall of the religious right has left Christians in America more confused than ever about what the task of Christian citizenship means and what the nature of our public witness should be. How can we be good citizens and faithful Christians in society where those are no longer the same thing? That is the question everyone's asking, and that's the question this event is partly trying to answer. So I think we don't think that the Davenant Trust is going to single-handedly solve all these problems for us or answer all these questions, but at Davenant Trust we are committed to trying to find our way forward by glancing backward. We think that, as I've mentioned a few times here, that in previous centuries, when the Christian faith was publicly proclaimed and rulers often did call on churches for counsel, Christians did not have the option of quietistically withdrawing from politics. But they had to think very seriously about what the business of government looked like and what Christian citizenship looked like, how the Bible spoke to these things, how nature spoke to these things. So there's a tremendous amount of wisdom to be found in how Christians of previous centuries have thought about the shape of our public life. So at the Davenant Trust, we aim to recover this wisdom and create networks that can bring together churchmen, scholars, and thoughtful Christians of all walks of life in conversation around these resources to help find a new way forward for the church in uncertain times. So I encourage you to check out, if you haven't already, our table there with some books, magazines, and other information about various projects that we're doing to give you a sense of all the things that we're up to. One of those I would mention is we have a study center in South Carolina that does summer programs for college students and young adults, the Protestant Wisdom Summer Program. But the most important thing that we were trying to do really is create communities of conversation, which this event here is an attempt to begin that. New York is obviously a major cultural, intellectual, economic, political, not political as such, but there's a lot of political influence that's concentrated in New York. And we think it's very important for Christians in New York to be forming communities of conversation dedicated to reading deeply within our Protestant tradition and finding in it wisdom for the church in society in the coming years. So we hope that this event here will just be the first of many. So certainly, we have your email address. We will keep you posted at future events. I'd also really like to invite you to consider partnering with us in this work as a financial supporter. We are a young ministry, and a little bit goes a long way. There are donation cards that were on the clipboards, be on the table there, that you can sign up to become a monthly donor, receive a copy of our magazine for free, receive other books that we publish, and be kind of the front of the line for events that we put on. So please consider doing that. Please keep us in your prayers, and please share our work with your friends and colleagues. Thank you.
Let us close in our time in prayer, and we will reconvene, those of you who are able to, tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. All good. Okay. So let's pray together. Almighty God, who are our light, our salvation, receive our thanks for your good gifts to us this night, and bless them to our meditation upon your ways and our loving influence among our neighbors. Through Jesus Christ, your Son, our Lord, we pray. Amen.
Before everyone goes, so in the spirit of continuing conversations, I've reserved on the recommendation actually of Aaron and Alyssa Wilkinson a bunch of spaces at the Malt House, I think it's called, like in about 15 minutes or so, half an hour. I'm gonna go over there. Anyone else who wants to go over there can come with me. I'm definitely going to be drinking something Protestant. You know what? I'm doing my best here. So come along to the Malt House if you'd like to. Come tomorrow if you'd like to, either for the morning session or the afternoon session or both. And there's going to be some pastries. Yeah, $25
for the whole day tomorrow. So it's
$25 for the whole day tomorrow.
Did you visit Cornerstone Press in Philadelphia several months ago? Yes.